It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you all today to our panel on cybersecurity, disinformation, and election infrastructure integrity, lessons and priorities in advance of the German federal election. My name is Rolf Nichols. Since summer 2020, I'm Vice President of the DGAP. In the past, cyber attacks, disinformation, and hybrid threats from a variety of states and actors have increasingly tried to undermine election processes in democratic countries. Even though the US has been touched by this type of interference, the last elections were considered to be safe and secure. As the federal elections approach, similar threats cannot be excluded for Germany either. So what lessons can be drawn from the US experience? Is Germany sufficiently prepared for digital interference in the election process? Which election systems, such as voter rolls, registration databases, and tabulation software, are vulnerable, and how can they best be protected? How to counter adversarial strategies? Is it time for Germany to classify election infrastructure as critical infrastructure? These and other important questions we are going to discuss today with our distinguished panelists from the US and from Germany. The event is part of our preparatory cycle for the upcoming federal elections this fall. We are very happy to have with us today Chris Krebs, who at the moment is founding partner at the Krebs Group and chair of the Commission on Information Disorder at the Aspen Institute. Previously, he served as the first director of the US Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity, and Infrastructure Security Agency, where he oversaw the agency's efforts to manage risk to US business and government agencies. Thank you very much, Christopher Krebs, for joining us. We're also very grateful to Gerhard Schabhuser for being with us today. I hope he's there now, but if not, he'll join us very shortly.
I'm here.
Okay, great. Dr. Schabhuser serves as Vice President of the Federal Office for Information Security, BSI. Dr. Schabhuser is a mathematician by training and has a very long and successful experience in cryptology, information security implementation, and oversight. He joined BSI already in 1991. Warm welcome to you, Dr. Schabhuser. We're also very happy to have with us today Dr. Alina Polyakova, who is President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, a famous US think tank. Dr. Polyakova is an expert on transatlantic relations, Russian foreign policy, and digital technologies. She authored the book, The Dark Side of European Integration, and numerous major reports on disinformation and democracy in Europe. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley and is fluent in German and Russian. Thank you very much, Alina Polyakova, for being with us today. Last but not least, it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Tyson Barker. Since October last year, Tyson is head of our Technology and Global Affairs program at DGAP. Previously, Tyson worked at Aspen Institute, where he was responsible for digital and transatlantic programs, and at the Bertelsmann Foundation. Originally, Tyson served in the Bureau for European and Eurasian Affairs at the US State Department. He holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Thanks very much, Tyson, for moderating this conference today. We are looking forward to a stimulating discussion with these top-notch individuals. I bet on active participation by our members. Now I've already talked too much and too long, and I'll hand it over to Tyson. The floor is yours, Tyson. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Rolf. And thanks for teeing up this discussion, which I think is going to be very interesting. As an American living in Germany, I'm always comparing the two systems, and coming out of the 2000 election, which, as we all know, was contentious not only on its merits of the politics, but also on the question of the integrity of the process. I couldn't think of a better group to have here to discuss it. One of the probably most cited post-election analyses came from CISA, where Chris Krebs was working at the time, which said that the US November election was the most secure election in US history, American history. And of course, the evidence that was provided by CISA, used by journalists and independent auditors, gave a lot of credibility to the process, which was quite important when people were questioning whether the process had been undermined due to cyber incidents or other things related to electronic voting systems. In Germany, as we know, we have paper ballots, and there is a paper ballot counting process. But we have to question whether or not paper ballots, the cyber process ends at the ballot box. What are the other processes involved in maintaining and securing the integrity of elections? And just thinking about the German elections in September, I think that although there are differences between the United States and Germany, big differences, there are also great similarities. We're talking about two federal systems where states have and local municipalities have major roles in implementing election processes. And it's quite a complicated process to manage. So I'm very happy that we have this group here today. This is on the record. We're going to start with opening statements from our speakers, and then we're going to have a little bit of discussion between the four of us, and open it up for Q&A from the members of DGAP. So let me start with a question for Dr. Schabhöser. How is the BSE safeguarding the integrity of German national elections in 2021? What has changed since 2017? And what are the lessons that could be learned from the 2020 US elections and even the 2021 Dutch elections? So let me give the floor to you.
Thank you very much for having the opportunity to say something about the security of the elections in Germany. As you might know, in Germany, we will have nearly a dozen elections until the end of 2022. So the federal election in September and many state level elections, two of which took already place on the 14th of March. Therefore, the cybersecurity of election is currently a very important topic for BSI. As you mentioned, in Germany, we typically have paper-based elections. So it sounds quite easy, no cyber threats available for the core process, for instance. But that's not the real truth afterwards. Of course, the process of voting is paper-based, and as it is counted by humans, the numbers of who is winning. But then the process starts of putting it all together, so it has to be transmitted from the local area to the stronger, the higher hierarchy, next level, and so on, until we come up by the federal returning officer who has to put it all together. And this is quite different in the different states. For instance, in small states like the Saarland, really small, or some city states, which we also have, it's more or less a process of, I have a phone call to the next level, I know him personally, authentication will be done by speaker recognition, and in parallel we do have something like SMS processes and so on, up to processes where it's a real digital process afterwards. And it is not a central tiered process of how it's done in the local world, so in the states and countries. This is, on the one hand side, sounds a little bit tricky, but on the other side, already in the last federal elections, BSI gave up a set of requirements which have to be fulfilled to get the integrity in place. We changed it a little bit and strengthened it in the sense that we now have a more or less comprehensive document where the relevant aspects which have to be solved are present. It's more or less based on ISO 20007, and the implementation is done by a German BSI Grundschutz, so baseline protection process of BSI. But nevertheless, the integrity and and the result of an election is not only dependent on the core process, as we call it, but also on the aspect, are the parties sufficiently protected? Is the IT system of the party protected correctly in the sense of cyber? So we have seen a lot of attacks in the last months that, yes, entering an IT system and encrypt it and steal the data and put the data to the public to change the mind, to get money and so on. In that arena, we are active to protect the core players in the election process, like the parties, the important candidates, and so think tanks which are relevant to mind setting and so on. We did it in several states levels of intensity, namely assisting the federal returning officer. Of course, yes, we are in this present at the election day with liaison officers to support them if there is an actual crisis, or so putting in the machinery of BSI to handle incidents if something happens. And we gave up process in the sense of, yes, what do you do personally as a candidate to secure your social accounts and so on? That is not that easy to jump in. And of course, we did some specific activities in assessing softwares in the pre-process of the elections, especially in the context of getting the correct candidates. There have been some virtual congresses of the parties in place, and there was a virtual and digital voting process, and we were in place there to secure them afterwards. Speaking about secure elections, I think I can conclude with a very short reference to the increasingly important fields of hybrid threats and helpful measures. The BSI pursue an all-hazard approach. This means that no matter what kind of attack happened, we initially respond the best way we can with all possible methods. A good protection against cybercrime, even protect against hybrid threats and other way around. It's so easy. An advanced level of cybersecurity in any form helps to secure the elections. Therefore, our usual task supports also the election process. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schabhuser. I think that you've mentioned a lot of things that I think would rhyme with the US process, even if the core function, as you said, is paper ballots across the board. There are lots of differences across states and a lot of ancillary processes that also need to be secured in order to guarantee election integrity. Chris Krebs, you had a frontline seat. You actually were in the driver's seat to provide a lot of that certification of the integrity of US elections. What were some of the lessons coming out of last year's experience, and what do you think would be most relevant for Germany and Europe?
Thank you, Tyson, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. I actually would start with our assessment of 2016. The 2016, the intelligence community in the United States released a report that that reviewed the Russian interference efforts in the 2016 election. And it essentially boiled down their attack to three different vectors. The first was attempts to compromise election infrastructure, election systems, election equipment. The second was targeting political parties. If you'll recall, there was a hack and leak operation where they got into the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee and released sensitive confidential documents. And then the third was just this broader an ongoing disinformation campaign to destabilize and sow confusion and doubt. And so we oriented around those three vectors as we prepared for the 2020 election, with three additional takeaways of where we needed to improve as the United States in our election security. First was that the federal government had no real meaningful way to coordinate defensive activities with state officials. And under the US Constitution, individual states or 50 states are responsible for administering federal elections. But there was no connection between the states and the federal security apparatus, at least in a meaningful way. So we had to improve that. The second was that the systems themselves were not where we think they should have been. There was some legacy equipment out there, some old, outdated systems. And I'm not just talking about the election machines that people vote on, but also some of the systems that help host voter registration databases, help design and print ballots, things of that nature. And then the third was, even within the federal government, between the security apparatus, there was not effective coordination. So we had to improve that. So fast forward to the 2020 election, we had a meaningful way to cooperate and coordinate with our federal partners. We improved security of the systems that state and locals use to conduct elections, with a key aspect there of moving to paper ballots as much as possible and eliminating the machines where you just touch a button and then a vote is registered on removable media, a thumb drive, basically. Those are impossible to audit. If hacked, it would be very difficult to prove whether the vote on those machines is legitimate. So we had to move away from those. And then the third and final was we really had a meaningful way to cooperate and coordinate with our partners in the intelligence community, in the military, and law enforcement. So as we prepared for 2020, having taken those internal steps, we also conducted a great deal of scenario development, threat modeling, exercises, and ultimately what it came down to was the risks, the scenarios that we were concerned about were not as much on the edge or at the day of voting. It was more about targeting of election voter registration systems. A potential ransomware attack, for instance, in the months running up to an election could be highly disruptive if you locked up those state level voter registration files. Similarly, on election night, you have ZDF, so you have a single or a much more limited media market than we do here, where you have multiple media outlets that could be reporting news. And one of the things we were concerned about is whether it was Russia, Iran, or China, or some other actor hacking into a TV news station and changing the ticker, just changing information that would flow across the bottom, and that could be highly disruptive and would immediately having a scramble. But ultimately where we landed was, it was not the technical threats that we were as concerned about. It was not cyber operations against election infrastructure. It was perception hacks. It was disinformation and claims that were beyond the scope or capability of an adversary, but the general voting public might not know that such a thing they were claiming was impossible. That's what we were worried about. And that's what happened. That's what happened here in the United States in the 2020 election, where we had disinformation campaigns, domestic in origin, amplified internationally, particularly by Russian outlets, that alleged that a foreign power had interfered with the election. And those claims continue to this day. And I have a number of observations of going forward, what needs to be done to improve transparency in elections, to increase trust in elections. It begins with paper, so you have that, which is always a good thing because you can go back and check the vote. The second is you need an authoritative and credible knowledge base of elections and how they work. The third is that you have to communicate to the public and increase transparency in the electoral process. The voters need to understand, and you have to demystify the election process. And then the fourth is you have to have a quick reaction force What's happening is our adversaries are hitting the gaps. They're not as much targeting us with technical, tactical measures. They're hitting us in between with disinformation and active measures. Germany has been at the forefront of active measures campaigns by a number of different governments for a century. And this is the sort of thing that you have internal capacity that you need to focus on, and you need to elevate the quick reaction capability. So just some real quick takeaways, Tyson, from 2020.
Thanks so much, Chris. There's a lot to work with there, and I'm really excited to bounce the ball also back to BSI and see how they're dealing with some of these questions, because I could imagine them coming up beyond the ballot box. But first, I want to go to Alina. You are somebody who has worked at the nexus of technology and democracy on both sides of the Atlantic. What are some observations, trends that you see in the kind of democracy integrity and technology space that you think would be relevant for Germany in 2021?
Well, thanks so much, Tyson. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to anyone who's joining from the United States like I am. I think Chris put out a lot of the points I was going to make. So I will just put a pin in some of the issues that he already brought up. I think an issue that we see as pervasive across the democratic space, certainly in Europe and the United States, is a lack of a whole systems view from our own governments. And Chris already touched on this quite effectively, but I think there's a few ways in which there's similarities between the United States and Germany and the lack of internal coordination that we're still seeing within the federal agencies. So we tend to have a siloed perception of hard cybersecurity threats, as Chris was saying, and we tend to parse that out from information threats, meaning disinformation and other types of information influence ops. But of course, from the adversarial perspective, and I'm here really talking about state-sponsored attacks in the information environment in the cyber domain, they don't see their targets in that parsed out siloed way. They have a whole systems approach, and they're able to calibrate their capabilities and capacities based on the kind of vulnerabilities they're trying to target. And I think we have actually spent too much time in some ways focusing elections. Don't get me wrong, elections are a critical and incredibly important event in any democratic society. But these kinds of operations, as Chris rightfully said, don't stop when we stop going to the ballot box in Germany or the United States. It's this constant drip, and we're living in a society now where we're not going to be rid of information influence operations because they are primarily now domestic in origin. They're not primarily coming from Russia or China. And frankly, we don't have a way to really see that proportion of how much is domestic, how much is foreign, because so much of it's happening on private social media platforms. But I think one thing that I have taken away from following what certainly the Russian operations have been in the United States and what they've done in other places on the front line, like Ukraine, like the Baltic states, like Georgia, and what they've been doing increasingly moving westwards in Europe as well, is that they're very good at knowing where our attention is and where our attention isn't. I'll bring one example from the recent US experience, which is, of course, we were focused so much on the 2020 elections as we should have been, and those were secure, as Chris rightfully said, and CISA gets a huge amount of credit for not just the securing the elections themselves from a hard security perspective, but from a communications perspective as well, from the messaging point. But at the same time, then we learned that we had the SolarWinds breach going on the entire time for months ahead of the elections. And perhaps we would become more aware of that if we had been looking at the whole system versus focusing on elections. So my point is that, yes, elections are important, but we need to understand how we can day in, day out, coordinate internally between the federal government agencies, also working closely with private sector companies and messaging to citizens. I think one place where in the US we're making progress is in the coordination between the information operations, which oddly enough have been carried out primarily by the counter information operations space, oddly enough have been carried out by the State Department. A lot of the funding from Congress has gone to the Global Engagement Center, which is in the public diplomacy division of the US State Department. And when you think about protecting the homeland, it doesn't make much sense. DHS certainly should have had the mandate from the very beginning to counter domestic threats in the disinformation space, but did not. I think we have now increasing threats in the cyber domain, including on the infrastructure space. And I think we'll talk about the recent Colonial Pipeline hack here as we progress. But I don't see, externally speaking, maybe it's happening internally, but I don't see who really owns this problem, the big problem of non-kinetic asymmetric threats and how we respond. What part does the US DoD have? What part does CISA have? What part does other parts of DHS and other parts of the State Department? And I see some of those similar gaps in coordination happening in Germany as well, and other European countries. The US is not unique here. I think it'd be very interesting to hear about that. And my last point is that I think on the transatlantic side, we've tried to establish some information sharing mechanisms, but the US has not really been involved in those. So we have the European Union trying to establish this rapid response, rapid alert system. I mean, the G7 establishes rapid response mechanism, but I don't see how those are actually effective tools. I haven't seen them in action. We need much more information sharing between governments to be able to get to a point where we can better assess potential threat levels so we can hopefully prevent attacks in the future. I think we need to keep in mind that's where we need to go. That's not about 2020 election, 2021 election, one disinformation campaign and one cyber attack. We are already in an environment where this is the battlefield. And we haven't quite come to terms with that. We haven't invested the kind of resources we invested in kinetic deterrence as we need to invest in non-kinetic deterrence. And that's really where we are today. But I don't think we've gone through that shift in our thinking about how do we protect our democracies and what we really need to do in terms of investment in technologies, investment in capabilities to be able to build greater deterrence against cyber and information influence operations going forward.
Thank you so much, Alina. That was an excellent contextualization of this question. As you correctly point out, that elections tend to focus the mind on cyber vulnerabilities and disinformation vulnerabilities, but they are not limited to that. And in fact, can be draw limited resources away from other threats and possibilities. And you also highlighted a lot of the questions around the kind of state-based architecture to manage or deal with some of these threats. Mr. Schaphauser, I'm going to take up some of the points that Chris Krebs and Alina brought up, and I'd like to ask you to start. First, a kind of technical question. In the United States, specifically in 2017 and early 2018, we heard a lot about potential tampering with voter registration rolls and the security of voter registration databases. And Chris Krebs brought up the possibility of ransomware, which was thankfully avoided. But what is the status of voter registration rolls in Germany, in the States? That's my first question. And then the second question I have for you is this issue of perception hacks. As Alina pointed out, one of the most successful elements of CISA's response was a perception counter hack, i.e. basically shoring up the credibility of the process and not letting it be undermined by disinformation campaigns, including something like changing a media ticker. How is BSI working to create perception counter hacks for the September election here?
Okay, let me try to come up with a registration process for the election. That is quite easy in Germany because we have a citizen record who is citizen in Germany, and every citizen who is older than 18 is available, has the right to vote in our election process. So we do not have a registration process for that. We don't have the need for that. The process of getting informed that that you are on the list, you are have the right to vote, is sent by classical snail mail. So you get a letter where is stated, yes, you are a potential voter, and you have to go to that point to do your work, and you aren't allowed to go anywhere for the election process. You have to go to a specific site where a paper-based list of election for getting registered. Yes, I gave up my vote afterwards. Of course, there is a cyber aspect in that aspect, because creation of the documents and so on will be done in the administration via electronic tools and so on. And therefore, it's very important to have high information assurance level in the different in the local government infrastructures afterwards. Fortunately, nothing happened till now in that process, but I fear that so 100% security will not be available. And one of my fears is that shortly before the process of creating those lists starts, a ransomware attack happens to those systems. And then it could be a hard job to get it in time in place afterwards. So it's, I think we have not the best level of cybersecurity within our administration. Depends a little bit on the states afterwards, but fortunately, we haven't seen ransomware attacks in the local governments, and that especially not in the federal government. For the federal government, it's quite easy. I know the status quite well due to the fact that ESI is responsible to do the monitoring there. Therefore, we know what happens there. For your second question, what do we do in doing something like perception hacks? Probably you have to give me some more minutes to think about, and probably I will come back to the question in the next round of questions. It's better to have, I have to think about what we do in that arena.
Happy to. Let me take up this issue of ransomware that you mentioned, that it doesn't seem like it has been a frequent occurrence with state and local governments in Germany yet, but it of course is occurring with increasing frequency in the United States. Chris, if you were to advise the German government on, threats on the horizon that they should watch for, how would ransomware fit into that, and what are some other issues that you would raise?
Well, certainly from a United States perspective, I have considered ransomware as probably the most underappreciated threat over the last 5 years, I'll say. And the reason I say that is because it has typically and historically been viewed as a law enforcement matter, a criminal matter. It started out small. We're targeting single individuals and demanding hundreds of dollars in Bitcoin, but it is now transformed into a successful global criminal enterprise with millions, if not tens of millions of dollars in ransom demands. And what we saw with Colonial Pipeline here in the United States was that a ransomware event could turn into a truly disruptive and potentially destructive attack that can target and affect the economy. I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, and there are still gas stations in my neighborhood that do not have gas supply. And, some people have run out of gas because of a criminal attack. So the conditions that have led us to this place with ransomware are, I think, threefold. First is that we, at least in the United States, with a number of our private sector companies, as well as our state and local government agencies, we've not invested enough in keeping modern technologies. So we have legacy, outdated, unsupported technologies, as well as we're just not doing the basics right. And sometimes the basics can be hard, but even things like multi-factor authentication have not been deployed at the scale or scope that I think we truly need. The second is the explosion of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin that happen outside of the realm of the traditional regulatory model of the economy and finance. Fiat currencies are very generally overseen with anti-money laundering and counterterrorism regulations. Cryptocurrency does not operate in that realm, so we need to do a better job of where cryptocurrency intersects with the traditional economy and the banking regulators, that we enforce things like know your customer and other transparency measures. And then the last thing is that we really have to start holding some of these criminals accountable, as well as the countries that provide them safe harbor. It is no mystery that a number of these ransomware crews operate out of Russian sovereign space. And, in a certain sense, it makes sense because it develops a cyber strategic force. It gives the teenagers and 20-year-olds something to do that's foreign and brings back a little bit of money. So there are no idle hands protesting in the streets. And it also, it aligns with the strategic objectives of the intelligence services, where it puts, agencies like CISA on constant alert, always responding. The instant response teams here in the United States are exhausted over the last year, whether it's ransomware or some of the FSB activities. And so I would be looking across that horizon and saying, what is next in Germany in terms of, do we have those same conditions? Do we not have updated systems? Are we not protecting our systems properly? Brentag Chemical, just last week, it was the U.S. subsidiary, but still there's a German nexus there. But, tilt it back over to the prior conversation, disinformation, active measures will continue to work at the seams as we focus on the technical silos, like Alina pointed out. They're going to continue moving like water towards the low spots, and it's in between those areas where we don't have proper federal coordination. And Alina hit it right on the nose. The biggest gap here in the United States to counter perception hacks and to counter disinformation is that there is no senior authority that is coordinating a strategic response to disinformation. That is the number one recommendation I have to every national authority and national government, is you have to have someone at a cabinet or sub-cabinet level that has clear ownership from a strategic perspective to countering disinformation.
Thanks for that, Chris. I'm going to ask one last question to Alina, and then we're going to open it up for questions and comments from our audience. And I know I've looked through the list. We've got some really impressive experts here on these topics, including some practitioners. Alina, you and I have both participated in some NATO workshops on topics around mis and disinformation and active measures. And you pointed out that a lot of times efforts are focused on state-backed operations, but increasingly those operations are metastasizing domestically. How do you draw the line between foreign disinformation influence operations and the point where they do start to take on a life of their own within domestic contexts? And how can we best counter them in a way that respects, sovereignty, democracy, and, the competences of different institutions like NATO?
Thanks for that easy question, Tyson. Appreciate it. Well, let me answer your question directly in just a second. I wanted to go back very quickly to what Chris ended his comments with, which is the need and the critical and urgent need that we now have had for years in all of our countries for someone who has a high level political mandate, a political appointee in the United States. I think that has to be at the undersecretary level or above, who's the counter disinformation czar, whatever we call that, it doesn't really matter. But this has been a recommendation that's been out there for years, and it's just a clear gap. And I hope that this administration sees that and moves to do something about it. And that actually leads me to your direct question about how do we draw the line? There is no line. It really doesn't exist anymore. I think we missed the opportunity to get the low-hanging fruit. What low-hanging fruit is that, you ask? State-sponsored info ops are the low-hanging fruit, because we were able in 2016 to still pinpoint the origins of these operations to a foreign country, to a foreign entity. We're able to attribute. We've lost, I think, the capability to do that because they've learned how to get around our detection tools. We're not going to get another IRA based in St. Petersburg anymore. Yes, they're still doing things, but we lost the ability to really see as to what is actually happening. Part of that is, I think, information sharing between private companies, social media platforms in particular, and we need to improve that kind of information sharing with intelligence agencies. And that has been happening, and the companies have been taking, I think, they deserve some credit. They've been taking some significant steps in trying to take down coordinated inauthentic behavior, as they call it, but this is still a whack-a-mole. And at this point, I don't think we can draw that line. It's gone. It's been gone for a long time. So I think we find ourselves in a situation where, one, we still have tools to impose punitive consequences on state actors who we can attribute operations to. I think to Chris's point about proxy criminal cyber groups, the relationship between the Russian government and these kinds of criminal cyber hackers goes far deeper than just providing them a safe space and harbor. The Russian intelligence agencies recruit from those groups directly. They allow them a safe harbor as long as they carry out only certain kinds of attacks. This serves the Russian foreign policy and strategic interest. There is a very close relationship between cyber criminal organizations that are functioning in Russia and the Russian intelligence agencies. And that relationship is at a level of people, meaning people going in and out between the two. It's at the level of strategic intent, and it's at the level of operational tactics and sophistication. And so we also can't separate those two. So we do have, things like sanctions that we can impose still on this very small part of the problem we're talking about, because it is a small part when it comes to information in operations. On the cyber side, I think is slightly different. We do have some capabilities there to deter, and I think we just haven't woken up to the reality. I don't know how. Since 2017, I would say that was a wake-up call. It should have been a wake-up call. The NotPetya attack in Ukraine that reverberated across the world, that affected German companies, that affected American companies, that even affected some Russian banks and financial institutions because it was so sloppy. It was an attack on Ukraine as part of the Russian war with Ukraine, but it reverberated globally. And we still haven't been able to grasp how we deter and impose consequences for attacks like that. So I think we're still swimming out there in some ambiguous waters, unfortunately. And I think NATO's role here also has to be to what I said earlier. Non-kinetic threats have to be part of the mandate. I'm not saying that we need to have a discussion now, though it's already happening, about Article 5 and cyber attacks. But it's a discussion we need to be engaged with. We need to make some decisions about. I don't have any illusions that's going to happen at the summit. I don't think we're going to see much at the June summit, except commitments made, which is important. But we really need to move forward in thinking about how do we invest in non-kinetic capacities, capability, and deterrence. And if we look at the US budget, if we look at any defense budget right now, that, sometimes you can just look at the numbers and where our priorities are. Our priorities aren't there.
Thanks, Alina. I think somebody said once, you show me your budget and I'll show you your values.
Exactly.
I think that definitely makes sense here. We are going to open it up for questions and comments from the audience, but I did want to give Dr. Schabhuser the opportunity to come in and come back to that question about perception hacks. And essentially, the question is, how is the BSI working to give German voters the confidence in the integrity of their elections?
Okay, so formally we have for the aspect of perception hacks and other information campaign established in the German government a workforce called hybrid, where all the ministries are involved in the sense of coordinating the activities. Like Alina said, that this is one of the most important things to do. And having said what about perception attacks and how to convince the citizen that it's sufficient secure, I think we have different tasks in the German government. For the one hand side, the Federal Press Office is responsible for the communication in the direction of the citizens. If it comes to counter disinformation things, the Foreign Office has also a role, and they are closely connected to do that. What is the role of BSI? Typically, we will give a short assessment of, from a technical point of view, what happened there, and then an assessment in the sense of, is it a real attack or is it something usual thing which happened there? And it's our task. We are in the workforce hybrid integrated, that we transform give our information on a short basis, so nearly in real time, to the Federal Press Office, which then typically goes to do it, to the communication to the citizens afterwards. I think this is the process we work on. So no direct work of BSI, but doing the giving the technical expertise to the professionals for communication afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question or a comment from Lutz Göllner. Lutz, you're up. Introduce yourself and ask or state what you want to state.
Thank you, Tyson, and great to see you, Alina, and many others. And thank you very much for these very, very impressive and important comments. I'm working for the European Union for the Diplomatic Service, the External Action Service. You know that we have invested a lot in this field of, let's say, addressing disinformation, foreign interference, and have actually developed kind of a real policy framework for this, which is called the European Democracy Action Plan. And I'm not talking too much about this, but you know that there are very different elements that we would like to bring together in terms of rules for political parties, in terms of media, let's say also here, support on the one side, but also stricter rules. And then, of course, on, let's say, the interference in the information space, specifically on disinformation, more stringent rules and even legislation for the platforms, but then a specific focus on the foreign actor side. And that would be kind of a question to both Chris and Alina. I mean, we are, I think, all in our professional work are still struggling with this internal-external nexus. You know, what do we do? How do we distinguish these two? And I think we still don't have a good approach. I mean, in our work, we focus on those cases where we know pretty well, where we can link it to the state actors, where we can have the state-sponsored outlets. But of course, this goes all very quickly into some gray zone and in between kind of, is it now external or internal? And my question to both of you is, one of the tendencies that we are seeing, that many others in the platforms are seeing, is an increasing commercialization, you know, of this sector. So more and more PR companies, sorry, I missed the very first kind of minutes of this discussion. I hope you didn't mention it already, but more and more PR companies are actually doing the job for the state actors with black PR. What can we do about this, you know, because this is opening yet another chapter that makes it more difficult for us, because then we would need to trace kind of the financial flows, who's paying them, etc. And I'm just wondering whether you have good ideas around this, and maybe an add-on to Chris, because especially in your new incarnation, also on the commercial side, we are still using kind of terminology that is going a bit in all directions: disinformation, interference, influence. I've seen in the report from the joint services, that they distinguish interference from influence now, kind of, which is more the cyber on the one hand, the influence on the other. We're working hard in the EU to put a bit of order in this, but also this is very, very difficult. Do you have the magic wand that we can use, Chris?
Oh, you raise a lot of really interesting points and highlight the sophistication of the market right now. One of all that said, what I tend to say is that, disinformation is the world's third oldest profession. We all know what the first one is. The second is intelligence operations, intelligence collection. The third is disinformation. And so as we were thinking about the election space, and how disinformation in general intersects with the American public, we had to think through, okay, who are the players involved? What are the equities? What are the objectives? And so we actually broke it down into almost a supply and demand approach, where from a supply side, it's always going to be coming in. And so we'll use the intelligence community, the military, the Department of Defense, and the platforms. And so they can go disrupt operations, whether it's Project Lakta or IRA coming out of St. Petersburg, or whether they've migrated to Ghana or Ukraine or even Mexico. You can identify inauthentic coordinated behavior, share it with the platforms, and they can go disrupt. But to the point, that is whack-a-mole, because they will always improve. When you put friction into their operations, they'll ditch that style and they'll adjust, and they continue like water flowing into the low points and the gaps. So we focused at CISA, at least, on demand. And it's not eradicating demand, because you can't do that, but it's informing and in trying to organically put people in a position where maybe they're not as receptive, or they can reject it. And it's about inoculation. And that was really what was behind the concept of our War on Pineapple awareness campaign from a couple of years ago, where we took the evolution, the anatomy and pathology of a disinformation campaign in a non-obtrusive way that people could engage with. So it's whether, it actually started in Canada, but it's a strangely American thing. Whether you like pineapple on your pizza, I think it's disgusting, personally. I don't put fruit on pizza, but nonetheless, it is a very binary option. You either like it or you don't. But nonetheless, it's about education. It's about building awareness. It's about transparency as well. And that, again, when we bring it back to elections, if it's a black box, it creates opportunity space for an adversary to insert confusion and doubt. So to the extent that you can get there before the bad guy, expose through a transparent way the mechanics of how things work, that helps suppress demand. It says, oh, you know what? So when the disinformation comes over and it hits the target's not receptive to it, because they understand that's not how things work. So that's, for us, I think we have to put a lot more investment into civics education, digital literacy, in education. And unfortunately, though, and this is the caveat, is that there is, certainly in the United States, there is a significant population of people that voted for the former president. I'm talking tens of millions of people, that it doesn't matter what anyone says. They're going to say you're part of the deep state or you're lying. And as long as the former president continues saying that the election was stolen, they are going to believe the election was stolen. They are gone. You will never recover them. So what we have to focus on now is, who are the people that are sitting on the fence, who are wavering, who might fall into that population? How do we keep them from falling into that population? How do we keep others from flowing into, as I call it, the fever swamp? That's the area that we need to focus on. Don't waste time over here. Focus on here.
Thanks, Chris. Elena, that was at you too. And then I'm going to give the floor back to Gerhard, and then we'll wrap up.
No, I'm glad that Chris brought up the pineapple, pizza pineapple campaign. I thought that was brilliant. It's what we should have been doing all along. It's very clear that appealing to people's basic emotions like humor is very key. And I think we've been very cautious. Governments, especially the US government, the State Department, are very cautious in how they use humor because it could be misinterpreted in different contexts. I remember having this conversation in 2015 in Washington before obviously the Russian interference in the 2016 elections came to light, where there wasn't much of an understanding of how to use these kinds of tools. Nobody cared too much about it at the time. And so I think we thought that disinformation, and Lutz, I agree with you, we're still in that back and forth in definitions. We could have another session about that. But it seems like most people understand disinformation to basically mean the same thing, which is the intentional spread of misleading information. But that is to say that early on we thought in the US, and I think in Germany and other Western European countries, that this was something that happened far away. This was something that happened in places like Ukraine and places like Estonia and elsewhere that we didn't have to worry about so much because we were so resilient. That of course we would not be targets and victims. Of course now, 6 years later, I think we've all learned otherwise. I do think there's a difference between where Germany and the United States is when it comes to some of the long-term resilience questions that Chris brought up. I think Germany's in a much better position in terms of civic education, digital skills, literacy, for one particular reason, which is the public education system, which in the United States, we have a very fractured, very localized educational system up to the post-secondary level. The idea of having a federal curriculum is a non-starter, I think, because we have so many private schools, charter schools, et cetera. But I think Germany's in a very good place. And I'll just say one very quick thing. I was actually in Germany right before the pandemic, and I met with teachers in North Rhine-Westphalia, and they came to me, and it was a really kind of strange discussion. It was about 4 or 5 teachers from I think a gymnasium and a few other, in another school in North Rhine-Westphalia. And they basically said to me, look, we're being asked to develop digital media literacy curricula, but no one taught us what that is. And so we have, the state asking us to teach our students, but we don't know. And I'm a math teacher, I'm a science teacher, and a student comes to me and says, how do I know something is a fact? And I don't know how to answer that question. So I think we're talking about, an approach that has to take into account the messengers, right? And the teachers are still quite trusted, they can cross many societies, certainly in Germany, but they also need the kinds of tools to be able to do what we're asking them to do.
Thanks, Alina. Final word to Dr. Schaphuse.
Thanks, Alina, for saying that our education system and school system is quite good. But you mentioned really an important point. And I think digitization and education is in Germany not that mature as it should be, because as Chris said, it's very important to get the citizen aware of techniques of this, how disinformation and digitization can work. What is the methods how I can check whether something is a fact or not a fact, to get a second assessment to that things, and so on. And as you mentioned, the teachers, yes, indeed, I think the digitization maturity of our teachers aren't sufficient to go in that direction ahead. And I think this is a challenge which we have. Fortunately, this is one positive aspect of our COVID-19 pandemic. This aspect forced us to digitize a lot of also in the education arena. That doesn't work really good, but it was more or less a wake-up call. Hey, we have to do something there, and I hope this will help us in getting a more higher maturity level in the context of, yes, digitization and assessment of threats and opportunities for our citizens afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schabhuser. You bring up a point that I think that the Germans are very interested in, which is digital IDs and their use with public administration, which of course is going to bring lots of new opportunities, but also new threat vectors as well. So this conversation will definitely continue. Thank you to all three of our speakers, Chris Krebs, Alina Polyukova, and Gerhard Schabhuser. I really appreciate this discussion. I personally am a fan of pineapple pizza, but clearly this is a topic that we will stick with, that and cybersecurity with the elections. Stay tuned for more of our work on the German elections and foreign policy. Thanks, everyone.